The chamber was built to make small things feel smaller. That was the point of it. The grand conclave hall of the Vethrani Accord stretched upward for 200 meters, its ceiling lost in a manufactured haze of soft violet light, its tiered galleries packed with delegate bodies in every shape the galaxy had produced. Thousands of them. And every one of those thousands was watching the feed, which meant every species with a receiver dish, a translation implant, or a functioning screen was watching too. That was also the point. Ambassador Yael Devon of Earth sat at a small rectangular table near the floor of the chamber. Not the center floor that was reserved for full conclave members. Earth's table was positioned just inside the outer ring, the provisional zone, where developing worlds sat, where dependent worlds would sit. Once the session concluded, she had a folio on the table in front of her, a glass of water to her right. Her deputy, Oren Mast, sat 2 seats down, his jaw set in the particular way it got when he was deciding not to say something he very much wanted to say. High Arbiter Savak of the Vethrani Conclave stood at the central podium. He was tall, even by Vethrani standards, with the pale, elongated skull and slow ceremonial movements his species used to signal authority. His robes were the deep green of someone who had never once doubted his own importance. He spoke in Vethrani Standard, which the translation implants rendered into every language simultaneously, so that his words arrived in 216 different tongues at once. He was tabling a motion. The motion, in its formal language, proposed the reclassification of Earth from provisional partner status to dependent world status, effective immediately upon vote confirmation. Dependent world status meant Earth's delegates lost voting rights on all conclave matters. It meant existing trade and resource agreements would be placed under Vethrani administrative review and renegotiated under new terms. It meant humanity would, in the formal language of galactic law, require a conclave sponsor to speak on its behalf in all future sessions. It meant, in language the formal documents did not use, but everyone understood Earth would be managed. Sivak presented his case for 11 minutes. He used charts. He referenced Earth's GDP contribution to interstellar trade as a percentage of galactic output. The number was small. He showed Earth's military reach, also small. He showed the age of Earth's deep space infrastructure, its limited colonial footprint, its short history of interstellar engagement. Young, marginal, statistically unremarkable. He presented Earth not as an enemy, but as a liability, a world playing at a table it hadn't earned, held up by the goodwill of established powers who could no longer afford the inefficiency. He said it all pleasantly. That was the real skill of it. The vote was called. Yael watched it happen. She watched the lights on the voting panel shift from neutral white to green, one delegation at a time. Some voted quickly. Some paused, checked their aids, voted green. The abstentions were pale gray. There were many of those. The political cowardice of species who didn't want to be seen choosing a side, but didn't want to protect Earth either. No one voted against. The motion passed in 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The chamber did not erupt. It never did during votes. There was a low murmur, the sound of 2,000 creatures processing information simultaneously. The feed indicators on the perimeter walls showed active broadcast on every major network. Hundreds of billions of viewers across the galaxy watching a small table in the outer ring. Sivak looked down at the provisional zone with an expression that was not quite contempt. Something more careful than contempt. Contempt was for equals. This was the look of an administrator confirming paperwork. He offered the floor to the Earth delegation for a formal response. This was protocol. A courtesy. The kind extended to inform a child the decision had been made. Yael Devon stood. She did not adjust her jacket or shuffle her papers. She was already composed. She had been composed for the entire session in a way that read, to anyone watching carefully, as something other than calm. Calm was the absence of feeling. What Yael wore was different. It was the face of someone who has already decided. She looked at Sevak. Then at the chamber. Then at the feed indicators. She said 6 words. We appreciate the clarity. Thank you. Her voice was even. No tremor, no edge, no performance of dignity. just the flat delivery of someone confirming an address. She closed her folio. She walked out. The chamber held a strange moment of silence, the kind that happens when an audience has braced for something that doesn't come. There were no tears, no raised voice, no demand for reconsideration, no impassioned speech about humanity's contributions, no appeal to the better natures of the assembled delegates. Just a door, swinging shut. Oren caught up with her in the corridor outside, his footsteps sharp on the polished stone floor. The corridor was lined with the seals of conclave member worlds, inlaid in colored metal, stretching back hundreds of meters. He pulled level with her, looked at the side of her face. She was watching where she was walking. Yael. He kept his voice low. The walls here had ears, not literally, not anymore, but old habits. What do we do? She didn't answer immediately. They walked past the seal of the Hevari Confederation, past the Drawn Collective, past 12 worlds, whose names humans were still learning to pronounce correctly. Get some sleep, she said. I'm serious. So am I. He stopped walking. She didn't. He stood and watched her continue down the corridor, her folio tucked under her arm, her pace unhurried, until she turned the corner at the far end and was gone. The corridor hummed with the ambient sound of the station recycled air through wide ducts, the distant vibration of transit systems, the quiet, enormous noise of a place built for power. Oren stood in it for a moment, alone, the seal of the Vethrani conclave directly above his head. He did not sleep. He went back to the compound and sat at his desk and watched the news feeds cycle through reaction coverage. Commentators on 40 networks dissected Earth's response, the walking out, the 6 words, the absence of any visible distress. Some read it as dignity. Most read it as defeat dressed up as dignity, which was the version that went most viral. A drawn political anchor called it the most graceful capitulation in modern conclave history. A Vethrani legal commentator spent 20 minutes explaining why Earth had no real options, which was true in the way that only looks at the surface of things. At 0130, Oren sent a message to Director Cho Lian at the Interstellar Agreements Office. The response came back in 40 seconds. It said, "We know. It's already started. Go to sleep, Oren." He stared at that for a long time. In her quarters, 2 floors up, Yael Devon had already turned off the feeds. She had brushed her teeth. She had set an alarm for 0600. She slept without any difficulty at all. Outside, the station rotated slowly in the dark, and the broadcast networks filled the silence with the sound of people explaining what had just happened to Earth. None of them were right. Not even close. The Interstellar Agreements Office did not look like a place where history happened. It looked like an accounting firm. Long rows of desks, screens running green columns of text, people in plain clothing drinking cold coffee out of containers that had been warm 4 hours ago. The walls were white. The lighting was the particular shade of fluorescent that made everyone look like they hadn't slept, which was accurate, because most of them hadn't. Director Cho Lian sat at the center desk, not the biggest desk, not the elevated one, just the center one, the one with the clearest line of sight to every screen in the room, and worked through a document that was, by volume, the longest she had ever opened. It was called, in the internal filing system, Package 7, Contingent. Everyone in the room called it the ledger. Cho had first opened the ledger 11 years ago, when it arrived in her inbox from a junior diplomatic posting on Vethrani Station, authored by a 34-year-old trade attorney named Yael Devon, who had apparently spent a very quiet 6-month rotation doing nothing but reading infrastructure contracts and asking a specific question, no one else. He had thought to ask, what would happen if we stopped? Not fought, not escalated, not protested, just stopped. The ledger was the answer to that question. It was a complete accounting of every service, system, license, corridor, and mechanism that Earth either built, maintained, co-owned, or quietly subsidized across galactic infrastructure. It wasn't compiled to be used. It was compiled to be understood. Yael had filed it under contingency, sealed it, and moved on with her career. Cho had read it once, and then locked it in the deepest folder she had, and tried not to think about it too much, because thinking about it too much felt like holding something very heavy in a very small room. Now she had it open on every screen. The principle was simple. Every agreement in the ledger had been signed with exit clauses, standard language, the kind that appears in every contract and that no one reads because exiting is never supposed to be the plan. The exit clauses specified conditions, timelines, notification requirements. Some required 30 days notice. Some required 90. Some had rolling renewal windows that, if not actively confirmed, simply lapsed. Yael had spent 6 months not just finding these clauses. She had spent 6 months ensuring they were structured so that the exit, when it came, would be simultaneous. A single coordinated lapse. Legal, documented, clean. Not a weapon. An accounting. At 0200, Cho's team began. They worked methodically, the way people work when the task is too large for urgency, and urgency would only cause mistakes. One agreement at a time. One notification filed, one renewal left unconfirmed, one license allowed to reach its natural end. Each action was logged. Each log was time-stamped. Each timestamp would matter. The Karev Trade Corridor Navigational Relay Network, a chain of maintenance buoys stretching 4 light-years through contested space, built by human engineers 20 years ago and maintained under a rolling service agreement, went into scheduled maintenance mode at 0217. The agreement renewal window had been open for 60 days. Earth's agreements office simply declined to confirm it. No sabotage, no override. The buoys kept running their last programmed routine, which involved a very long maintenance diagnostic that would, technically, complete in approximately 8 months. The pharmaceutical licensing block, 41 medical compounds, developed by Earth research institutions and co-licensed to galactic distributors under agreements that renewed annually, hit their renewal date at 0400 by Conclave Standard Time. The office had held the renewal authorizations in queue for 6 weeks. At 0400, the queue was cleared. Not approved. Cleared. The licenses lapsed on their own terms. Translation architecture was more delicate. Earth had not built the Conclave's translation systems, but humans had provided, for 16 years, the linguistic correction datasets that kept those systems accurate, subtle, rolling updates that accounted for drift in living languages, new vocabulary, idiomatic shifts. The datasets updated on a subscription model. The subscription had a termination clause requiring 48 hours notice. The notice had been sent filed, logged, time-stamped 49 hours ago from a sub-office under a filing category that no automated system had flagged. Oren Mast arrived at 0300. He had not slept. He had taken the transit from the diplomatic compound to the agreements office and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room, before one of Cho's staff pointed him to a chair near the center desk. He sat. He watched. He didn't ask many questions in the beginning. He read the screens. He watched the ledger shrink, line by line, as each item was processed and filed. He had known, abstractly, that Earth's contributions to galactic infrastructure were significant. He had attended the briefings. He had read the summary documents. But there is a difference between reading that a number is large and watching what it looks like when it moves. Around 0430, he leaned toward Cho. "How long has this been ready?" he asked. Cho didn't look up from her screen. "The package? 11 years. And the preparation for tonight, specifically? We started pre-positioning 3 months ago, when the reclassification motion was first drafted." She turned a page. "We had the vote count 2 weeks before the session." Oren sat with that. At 0500, the Karev buoys had been dark for 3 hours. 7 pharmaceutical distribution networks were running on existing stockpiles. The translation system correction feeds had not updated since 0000. He looked at the volume of what had been processed, then at what remained. "They have no idea, do they?" Cho didn't answer immediately. She finished a notation, took a sip of something that had been coffee once. They had 11 years to look. That was it. That was the full explanation, delivered without heat, without satisfaction, without the slightest decoration. Just a fact. They had 11 years to look at the structure of their own infrastructure and ask the question Yael had asked at 34, on a quiet posting with too much time and too clear a view. They hadn't asked. That was their problem. By 0545, the ledger was complete. Cho closed the main document, archived the logs in triplicate, and sent a single message to Yael Devon's communications channel. It said, "Done." The response came in 12 seconds. It said, "Thank you. See you at 9. Cho turned off her screen, stood up, and told her team to get breakfast. Outside the station's observation windows, the stars held their positions with the indifference they always had. The galaxy did not know yet what had changed. The signals were still moving at the speed of light. The consequences were still traveling. But the ledger was closed, and the night shift was over. The morning session was supposed to be a formality. That was how Sevek had structured it. The vote was done, the reclassification was on record, and today's session existed for one purpose: Earth's formal acknowledgement of its new status, the signing of the restructured agreements, and the public close of what had been a clean and well-managed administrative process. An hour, perhaps 2. Then lunch. Then the afternoon calendar. Then the galaxy moving forward under clearer terms. He had even told his communications aide he would be available for interviews by midday. The conclave chamber was quieter than the previous session. No gallery crowds, no full broadcast feed, just the working delegates and the procedural staff. A smaller audience for a smaller moment. The documentation was already printed and stacked on the table in the outer ring, waiting for signatures. Yael Devon arrived at 5 minutes to 9. She was dressed the same as the day before. Same folio, same glass of water placed to her right, same unreadable composure. Oren sat beside her this time, not 2 seats down. He had not slept, and it showed in the set of his shoulders, the focused stillness of a man running on attention alone. Sivak opened the session with brief remarks about the transition process and the path toward a productive new relationship between the conclave and its dependent worlds. He used the word times productive times 4 times. He used times clarity times twice. He did not use times humiliation times, because there was no need to name a thing that had already been accomplished. He nodded to his lead counsel, who stood and moved toward the signing table. The counsel reached for the first document. His communications implant chimed. He paused, tapped the implant to silence it. Reached again. It chimed again. He frowned, tapped it harder. The frown deepened into something else when it chimed a 3rd time, and then a 4th, and then kept going in the rapid triple pulse pattern that only meant priority escalation. He looked at Savak. Savak's own implant had begun to pulse. Around the chamber, aides were suddenly bending toward the delegates they served, whispering, holding out data tablets. And the whispers had a quality to them that Oren recognized, not alarm yet, but the sound of people trying to establish whether alarm was appropriate. Savak raised one hand to pause the session. His aide pressed a tablet against his palm. He read what was on it. He read it again. The Karev Trade Corridor. The Karev Trade Corridor was one of the most used shipping lanes in the intergalactic region, an optimized path through a stretch of gravitationally complex space that required continuous navigational correction to traverse safely. The correction data came from a relay network of maintenance buoys. The buoys had been built by human engineering teams over a period of 9 years. They were maintained under a rolling service agreement between Earth's Infrastructure Division and the Karev Transit Authority. The buoys were currently running a maintenance diagnostic. All of them. Simultaneously. Without the correction feeds, the corridor was not impassable, but it was dangerous enough that no reputable shipping company would send a loaded freighter through it. The rerouting options added between 4 and 6 weeks to transit times, depending on destination. Sivak looked up from the tablet. Across the chamber, a delegate from the Hivari Confederation was receiving a similar briefing. Then, the Drawn Collectives table. Then the merchant sovereignty delegates were on their feet entirely, talking over each other in their complex, layered voice language, and their translator was struggling to keep pace. Sivak's second alert came before the first had fully settled. 17 pharmaceutical licenses, compounds in active distribution, across 14 conclave member worlds, had lapsed at 0400 that morning. The renewal window had passed. The licenses were not suspended, not revoked, not contested. They had simply not been renewed. Under conclave commercial law, distribution of unlicensed pharmaceutical compounds was a Category 3 violation. Every distribution network currently holding those compounds was, as of this moment, operating in technical breach. The room was louder now. The third alert was about the translation systems. It was, of all of them, the strangest. Not the most economically significant, not the most immediately disruptive, but the one that seemed to land differently on the people in the room. The conclave's translation architecture had been running without its correction feed update since midnight. The system was still functional, but the drift was already measurable in 3 low-frequency languages, and the projection showed it accelerating. In 6 months, without correction data, the translation of certain conclave languages would begin to produce errors, not gross errors, subtle ones, the kind that cause misunderstandings in legal language, the kind that void contracts. HFY stood. The chamber had stopped resembling a formal session. It had become something noisier and less dignified than that. Delegates were standing, aides were running, actually running, which almost never happened in the conclave chamber. And the procedural staff had frozen in the practiced way of people who are very good at their jobs and have just encountered something their jobs did not prepare them for. HFY looked across the chamber floor at the Earth delegation's table. Yael Devon was reading something on her folio with what appeared to be mild professional interest. The posture of someone reviewing routine correspondence. Her water glass was still full. She had not moved. He crossed the floor. He had never crossed the floor to address an outer ring delegation directly. It was not done. The outer ring delegates came to the podium, or they waited for the floor to be offered. But his implant was still pulsing, and more reports were coming, and the merchant sovereignty representatives were making a sound he had never heard them make before. He stopped at the edge of the outer ring. He looked at her. She looked up from her folio. Ambassador Devon. His voice was controlled. HFY was good at controlled. Perhaps you could explain what is happening. Yael held his gaze. Her expression did not change. It was not hostile. It was not warm. I'm not sure I understand the question, she said. The corridor. The licenses. The translation feeds. Maintenance, she said. Lapsed renewals. A subscription termination we filed 49 hours ago, inside the contractual notice window. She tilted her head, very slightly. All properly documented. HFY felt something he was not accustomed to feeling inside this chamber. This is a response to yesterday's vote. Yael considered the table in front of her for a moment, the way a person does when selecting exact words from a large and careful supply. High Arbiter, she said. Yesterday's vote reclassified Earth as a dependent world. A dependent world, under conclave charter, is not a partner. It's a managed territory. She placed her hand flat on the closed folio. We appreciated the clarity. We acted accordingly. The chamber noise had not quieted. If anything, it had grown. HFY looked at her for a long moment, then at the chamber, then at the stack of documents on the signing table, waiting for signatures that were no longer the most pressing item in the room. He said, "What do you want?" It was the wrong question. She did not say so. She simply picked up her folio, tucked it under her arm, and stood. "I'm sorry," she said, in the same voice she had used for 6 words the day before. Were we still in a relationship? She walked toward the chamber exit. Oren rose and followed. Neither of them looked back at the stack of unsigned documents, or at HFY standing at the edge of the outer ring with the sound of a galaxy discovering what it had taken for granted filling the air around him. The door swung shut, exactly as it had the day before, except this time, the silence that followed was a different kind of silence entirely. The emergency closed session was requested by 11 delegations simultaneously, which was a procedural anomaly. The conclave chamber's management system had not been programmed to handle cleanly. It handled it anyway, after a fashion. By noon, the chamber had been cleared of observers and press feeds, the gallery sealed, and the remaining delegates arranged around the central floor in a configuration that looked less like a governing body and more like a group of people, trying very hard not to show how fast their afternoon had deteriorated. Sci-Fi presided, because presiding was what he did. But the shape of the session was different from anything in recent conclave history. Normally, closed sessions were for sensitive negotiations, things that required privacy, because they involved real power being moved carefully between real powers. This session involved species discovering, one after another, in an order determined purely by how quickly their infrastructure monitoring systems generated alerts, that they had a problem. The merchant sovereignty went first, because their problem was the most immediate. The Kharov corridor was not simply inconvenient for them. A significant portion of their seasonal trade window, the specific months, when their primary agricultural exports reached peak market value, across 6 importing worlds, ran through that corridor. The rerouting options added 5 weeks. 5 weeks was the difference between their exports arriving at peak price and arriving at the beginning of the next agricultural cycle, when prices collapsed. They were not talking about disruption. They were talking about the destruction of an entire season's margin for thousands of trading families, for a corridor maintained under a rolling service agreement that had been renewed automatically for 22 years. The Drawn Collective's delegate spoke next. 3 of the 17 lapsed pharmaceutical licenses covered compounds their species used for a common degenerative condition. Not rare, not exotic common. The compounds were currently in distribution, legally, under existing inventory. But manufacturing new stock required the license. Without renewal, their medical supply chain had a horizon problem. It would not become a crisis today or this month. In 8 months, perhaps 9, it would become something that looked very much like a crisis. The Hivari Confederation had a different issue, quieter in the short term, more structural in the long one. They manufactured data-sensitive equipment, navigational, medical, communications. Their manufacturing quality standards had been certified, for 14 years, by a joint Earth Conclave certification body that Earth co-administered. Without Earth's participation, the certification body's outputs fell below the threshold required for conclave-wide distribution approval under commercial law. Not Earth's law. Conclave law. A certification architecture that the conclave had designed, administered in part by Earth because Earth had asked to be useful, and the conclave had said yes, and now the conclave had managed to make Earth not a partner, which meant the architecture was missing a leg. There were 12 more presentations after that. Some were large. Some were medium-sized. One involved a water processing patent that sounded minor until the delegate explained how many stations in the outer systems used that processing method and had no alternative licensed option. Sivak listened to all of it without expression. He was excellent at listening without expression. He had practiced it for 40 years. But there was something accumulating behind his eyes as the session went on, not panic. He was too disciplined for panic. And not anger, because anger required a target that was behaving wrongly. Something more like the sensation of a floor he had always assumed was solid. Demonstrating, one plank at a time, that it had been held up by something he had never looked at. At the midpoint of the session, he called a recess and went to a private chamber with his senior counsel and his lead analyst. The analyst had been running numbers since morning. He showed Sivak the numbers. The total economic exposure represented by the lapsed and withdrawn agreements, direct costs, rerouting costs, supply chain disruption, legal risk from the certification gap, downstream effects on the derivative trade relationships that had built up around the agreements like mineral deposits around a pipe, was not a number. Sivak would have guessed if asked before yesterday. It was not small. How, Sivak said, after a moment, was so much of this held by one world? The analyst looked at his screen, then at the floor, then back at Sivak. Because they built it, he said. Most of it. And they maintained it. He turned the screen so Sivak could see the timeline. They started integrating into infrastructure roles about 40 years ago. Early on, when the conclave was consolidating its structure and there was significant functional demand for technical administration, Earth was new. They had good engineers. They were willing to do unglamorous work. Maintenance, Sivak said. Maintenance, the analyst confirmed. The buoys, the certification bodies, the translation datasets, the licensing architecture. The navigational surveys in contested corridors. All unglamorous. All essential. All human. Sivak stood at the window of the private chamber for a moment. The station turned around them. They did this deliberately. I think, the analyst said carefully. They did their jobs very well for 40 years, and the ledger is what good jobs look like, from the inside of an audit. When the session resumed, Sivak faced the chamber again. He asked Yael Devon to be present. She came. She sat in the outer ring again, in the same seat, with the same folio and the same water glass. She had not asked for anything, and had not offered anything. She had simply come when asked. Sivak presented the situation to her directly. The corridor, the licenses, the certification body, the translation feeds, the sum of what the morning had produced. He asked, with the care of a man choosing each word like he was diffusing something, whether Earth intended to restore the agreements. Yael opened her folio. She did not look at it. She looked at him. That depends, she said, on what Earth is. I don't follow. Yesterday, this chamber reclassified Earth as a dependent world. A dependent world does not have agreements with the conclave. She placed her hand on the open page. It has conditions of management, so I want to understand clearly which version of Earth you are speaking to, because the answer is different depending on that. The chamber was very quiet. Sivak looked at the faces around him, at the merchant sovereignty delegates, at the Hevery Confederation, at the Drawn Collective's medic representative, who had said very little, but who had not looked away from Yael since she entered the room. He looked back at her. A partner, he said. The word cost him something. The chamber felt it. Yael closed her folio. Then we have something to discuss, she said. She did not smile. She did not let him see anything that looked like victory or satisfaction, or the release that comes after a long patience, finally spent. She just turned to the next page and set her pen down on the table and waited for them to begin. Outside the station, in the dark between systems, relay buoys ran their diagnostics. Pharmaceutical stockpiles counted down toward a horizon. Translation systems drifted, by fractions of degrees, away from precise. Everything waiting for a decision. Everything patient. Like it had been taught to be. 2 days later, the table was smaller. Not physically, it was the same conference room in the conclave's administrative wing, the same long surface of dark composite material, the same ambient lighting that the Vethrani favored for working sessions, but smaller in the way that rooms feel smaller when the pretense has been cleared out of them. No galleries, no feed indicators, no ceremonial robes. Sivak sat on one side with his lead counsel and 2 senior technical advisors. Yael Devon sat on the other side with Oren and a single aide, a young woman named Petra, who was there to manage documents, and who managed them with extreme efficiency and no expression whatsoever. The dependent world reclassification had been administratively withdrawn the previous afternoon. The formal language described it as a procedural reconsideration based on evolving partner assessment metrics. No one in the room used the formal language. No one needed to. The withdrawal had taken 4 minutes and 13 seconds to process once Sivak's office submitted it, which was notably faster than the vote that had created it. 7 delegations had sent private communiques to Earth's diplomatic channel in the 24 hours since the closed session. The communiques used varied language, some formal, some almost conversational, but they shared a common shape, an expression of regret at a misunderstanding, a desire to maintain existing relationships, an assurance that the vote had not reflected any individual delegation's true position on Earth's value as a partner. Oren had read all 7. He had not replied to any of them. He was waiting for Yael's instruction on that, and she had told him, when he asked, to leave them for now. They would keep. The renegotiation took 4 hours. It was not combative. It was something more uncomfortable than combative. It was the specific awkwardness of a situation where one party has a great deal to apologize for and no graceful way to do it, and the other party has no interest in making it easier for them. Yael worked through the agreement terms line by line. She had a copy of the original partnership framework, the one that had been in place before the reclassification vote, the one that Sivak's motion had proposed renegotiating under new terms. She used it as her base document. She did not add to it. This was the thing that Sevak had expected, on some level, and had not expected on every other level. He had prepared his team for demands. The Conclave's legal staff had spent 2 days modeling scenarios what Earth would ask for, what leverage they would press, what expanded rights, or increased trade terms, or enhanced voting status they would extract in exchange for restoring the agreements. Earth asked for none of it. Point by point, Yael worked through the original framework and offered it back, unchanged. The same terms, the same maintenance agreements, the same licensing structures, the same certification body framework, exactly what had existed before the vote. Sevak's lead counsel leaned toward him once, during a break in the discussion, and said quietly that he did not understand. Sevak did not answer immediately. He had been trying to understand it since the morning session. He had turned it over throughout the previous night, with the focus of a man whose strategic instincts had spent 40 years being reliable, and were now producing no output he recognized. Earth had leverage. Earth had demonstrable, documented, catastrophic leverage, and they were not using it. They were handing it back. Why? He watched Yael work through a navigational maintenance clause, with the same low-effect concentration she brought to everything clear, direct, free of theater, and he thought he might be beginning to understand, but he was not sure he liked what he was beginning to understand. They reached the final page at the late afternoon. Sevak signed. His counsel signed. His technical advisors initialed the annexes. Petra collected the pages with swift efficiency, organized them, and set the completed document in front of Yael, who reviewed the last page, confirmed Petra's notation, and closed the folder. The session was over. People began gathering their materials. The technical advisors were already at the door. Oren was talking quietly to Petra about transmission protocols for filing the restored agreements. Sevak was still at the table. Yael was putting her folio into her bag. He spoke before he had entirely decided to. "Ambassador." She looked up. "Off the record." He said it in Vethrani Standard, which the room's translation system rendered automatically. But the phrase had a weight in Vethrani that didn't fully transfer a specific register used for something said between individuals, not officials. You had leverage. Real leverage. We both know what those agreements are worth. He set his hands flat on the table. Why did you not use it? The room had gone quiet. Oren had stopped talking. Petra held the folder perfectly still. Yael looked at Sevak for a moment, not studying him, not deciding whether to answer. She already knew whether to answer. She was just giving the question its appropriate weight before she responded. "We are not interested in winning," she said. "We are interested in working. There is a difference." He held her gaze. "You should write it down," she said. She picked up her bag. She looked at Oren, who fell in beside her. Petra was already at the door. Sevak stayed at the table. He stayed there for some time after the Earth delegation left, in the quiet of the conference room, with the signed agreement in front of him, and the view of the station's outer corridor through the narrow window. Ships moved through the docking bays below. The transit systems hummed. Somewhere in the network, the Karev corridor buoys were coming out of their maintenance diagnostic. Pharmaceutical renewal confirmations were processing. Translation correction feeds were resuming their regular update cycle. Everything returning to normal. Which was the point. He had spent 2 days trying to find the strategic logic of what Earth had done, and he had found it. He understood the mechanism, the ledger, the exits built into agreements that no one read, the 40 years of patient infrastructure work. But the mechanism was not the logic. The mechanism was just the how. The why was something else. The why was that Earth had spent 40 years building things that were genuinely useful and asking for nothing more than what was agreed. And when the Conclave had decided that was weakness, Earth had not changed its position. It had just let the Conclave feel the weight of what freely given support actually weighed, and then offered to pick it back up, for the same price as before. That was not a strategic position. That was not leverage being maximized, or power being consolidated, or opportunity being harvested. It was something that Sevak did not have a word for in Vethrani Standard, and he suspected that was because his civilization had not needed the word in quite some time. He picked up the agreement. He read it again, beginning to end, every clause he had signed without fully absorbing in the session. It was a good agreement. It always had been. Earth's people were excellent at writing agreements that were good for everyone. That was why they had been asked to co-administer half the conclave's unglamorous architecture in the first place. He set it down. In the corridor outside, Yael and Oren were walking toward the transit bay. Their footsteps had the sound of people who were done with a thing and ready to move on to the next one. Oren waited until they were clear of the administrative wing before he said anything. When he spoke, it was quietly. You had that planned for 11 years. Yael's pace did not change. The folder. Not the insult. They provided that themselves. He walked beside her. The transit bay was at the end of the corridor. Through the bay's wide windows, the dark between stars stretched in every direction, patient and enormous, lit at its edges by systems that ran, in no small part, on the unglamorous work of people who had learned a very long time ago that the species which maintains the pipes is never as powerless as the species that never learned to read the contracts. Do you think he understood? Oren asked. Yael considered this for a moment. He will, she said. They stepped into the transit bay. The doors closed behind them. The station turned in the dark, and the galaxy went on working, as it always had, on terms that had always, quietly, been Earth's to set.